Okay, hello. I thought I would do another round on Overmind and suspense. I didn't do it the right time the first time, which is why I have these iterations to get feedback and kind of like twist how like the perspective I have so that we can consider different APIs and stuff. So what we're going to do now is actually implement an API for suspense in Overmind. So I hope that can be useful. Even though you don't know Overmind, we can talk about how suspense actually works. So let's see. First of all, the person I got some feedback from is Luis. I've talked to him before because he runs, he's part of a startup called Frontity, which is really awesome. And we've been talking about state management and stuff. And he gave me some feedback related to my initial approach to suspense, which was basically put it as part of the configuration of your application. But he talked more about using it directly in components. Where we kind of like misaligned a little bit to begin with was the perspective, because he was from the perspective of data fetching, and I was thinking about just promises in general, because that is what suspense is. It's promise management. It's not specific to data. But anyways, so he played around with some different APIs, one being very similar to the one in the React example, which we're going to use and refactor. And then there's a more generic version where you have like a suspend function, which you can give a promise, and then it will, I'm not exactly sure how this would work underneath, but yeah, conceptually it's a bit more generic. And then you have something even more generic where you just have some data, and then you can wait for something specific to be truthy to make that suspense promise resolve, not being thrown up to the suspense component. So I looked at that, and initially it didn't like trigger anything, but then I think about it and then it triggers something. So what I came up with here is this thing. So the Overmind React package should ideally have this implementation because it's React specific. So what we're going to do is expose a new function, and I'm calling it suspend. I'm not sure if that's the right word for it, because you have suspense, and do you then suspend to trigger the suspense, or like, I'm not really sure, but we're going to call it suspend. And the way it's going to work is that we're just going to allow you to suspend any kind of state, meaning that if the state you point to here is null or undefined, it basically means that this state isn't ready yet. So it will wait for that state to become like truthy, and then it will return that state on this variable and you can use it. If it's not truthy, it will throw a promise up to any parent suspense component, and that will suspend the rendering of that component. Yes. Yeah, so I guess suspend is a good word for it. Anyways, I have the example here. I moved it to TypeScript because we're going to refactor or implement in the Overmind React package, which I basically just copied into the sandbox. And here we can see we have this example with fetch profile data, which is like a fake API thing. I think Dan Abramov made this example. And then we have a profile page where we suspend profile details with a nested suspense on profile timeline, which holds the posts. So the profile details reads a resource here, and this is what manages the suspense promise. So when the user is not available, it throws a promise up to this suspense. And when that promise resolves, this suspense will make the profile details and everything else render again. What's interesting though is that even though we throw inside profile details, it will still run this logic. So it will actually also try to read the posts, even though we throw in profile details. And this is the way React works. Like when we render this, it doesn't move into profile details at this point. It doesn't run this code. It runs all this code, And then it starts like lazily render each component, or like produce the render result, or whatever you want to call it. Anyways, so it fetches the posts and it does the exact same thing, only that there's a nested suspense that will take hold of this suspense promise. Cool. So what we're going to do is have a look at Overmind here. So I'm using the same fake API, fetch user and fetch posts, but I've created like a typical Overmind configuration where we do not fetch the data when the components render, because that's actually a bad pattern to trigger data fetching with components, because you typically want to start fetching data before you render anything. This is also something we saw from the relay talk at the last ReactConf. They talked about how they wanted to trigger their queries before actually moving to a new page and stuff. So in this example, I'm just firing off a couple of actions on initialize. This could actually just be one action. Like this is just an example. But the point is that when Overmind initializes, it instantly triggers these two actions, which will go in and grab the user. And I've added fetch user and fetch posts to an effect here. And like this is how you would typically write an application. Like the example here is oversimplified. Like you wouldn't do this thing either in an application. So this is more real. Yes. So we just wait for fetch user, and there's nothing special about this. You could do anything. You could read from local storage. It could be GraphQL. It could be anything. Like whatever promise or whatever logic you would typically write there, you would just write as normal. So suspense doesn't affect how you write your Overmind code at all. But as you can see, the user and the posts are null to begin with. So let's go in here now and change this around. So we'll replace this resource with an Overmind instance. Create Overmind with the config. And then we'll have to render using the provider. Overmind. The provider like that. And then we're going to replace this. We're going to grab the state from use Overmind. We're going to grab the user here instead. And this will, of course, not work because we don't have any data there. Let's see, I just have to refresh. Yeah, so it just completely breaks. So what we're going to do is expose this suspend thing. So we are going to be able to suspend this. And if the state is already there, it will just return it instantly. But if it's not there, it's going to throw a promise up to the suspense. And when it resolves, it will try to render again. But we don't even have suspend. So what we're going to do now is look into the Overmind React package. So this Overmind React package has quite a bit of typing. It has the implementation for create hook, and it also has the higher order component version, which we're not going to look at. But let's see where we can implement this. So here, this is where we return the state, actions, effects, and reaction from the hook. Also add mutation listener. You should probably not, that was like before we had reaction. Anyways, so what we're going to do is create our suspense function. And we're not going to do typing and stuff here. Suspend. And as you know, this takes a callback. It takes this callback of returning some state. So what we need to do initially is just call that callback. We have to figure out what is this value. Do we have it? And if the value equals null or the value equals undefined, that means we're going to do some suspend stuff. But if it's not there, we just return the value. Okay? Cool. So now comes the tricky thing. So first of all, what we have to make sure of is that when we use the Overmind hook, we create a tracking tree, as we call it, which starts tracking whatever state you access. Now, if we suddenly throw inside this component, it's not able to clean up that that work. So we have to do it for it. Yeah, we have to do it for it, whatever. Overmind as any. We have the Overmind instance here. Then we have proxy state tree. And here we have a function called dispose tree. And we are just going to dispose the tree that was created for tracking state. That's the first thing we do. And then we're going to throw a promise. So this is what suspense does. Whenever you want to stop rendering and tell suspense that, hey, I have some more work to do before you can render me again, you throw a promise. And this promise cannot really reject in terms of what we are doing, because typically these examples are with data fetching, which could resolve or could be rejected. But we are just waiting for some state to be populated, so it can't really be rejected. And what we're going to do here is that we're going to use something called a flush listener from Overmind. Like, Overmind has two different listeners. It has a mutation listener and it has a flush listener. A mutation listener triggers for every mutation, like exactly when it happens, while a flush listener triggers when Overmind has batched up synchronous mutations and kind of like notifies the components about updating. So we're going to use that version. And this returns a dispose function so that we can dispose of this listener. And again, we find this on Overmind instance, and we're not going to look at any of the arguments, because what we can do when this triggers is just figure out if do we have the value now. So if value is still null or new value is still undefined, we don't do anything. We just keep the listener running. But if it's there, we are going to, first of all, we're going to dispose of the listener because we don't need it anymore. And then we're going to resolve our promise here. So you can imagine that this promise now lives in the suspense component higher up in the component tree. And when we call resolve here, we're basically telling that suspense component, hey, it's time to try to render again. Yes, I believe that's it. And then we need to give it suspend here. And let's try to refresh. Loading. Yeah. So now we actually got it working. As you can see, let's look at the API again. We have suspended state.user and state.posts. And it shows loading indication. And then, yeah, it moves as it's supposed to. Now, I think this is really powerful to think about suspense in terms of state being available or not. And you could, of course, use this with anything. Even like there's nothing special here about this. We could use this with Redux as well, because the store in Redux does the same. It kind of like notifies with an event when there's an update in the store, and then you could just run the callback to figure out if it should render again. But what it does is decouple. It makes it simpler because it's only about, okay, I want this state. I want to work with this state. I don't care where that state is populated from reading from the server or from local storage, or maybe it's some other asynchronous process that needs to kind of like run before that state can be populated. And yeah, that's basically it. You might, yeah, no, that's basically it. I'm not going to start my next trail of thought here. I want to stop here. So one thing that is a bit interesting looking at this, actually I found a bug inside Overmind related to this, like a real edge case thing. I don't have to go into that, but just doing that was nice, so that we fixed that bug, even though it was a edge case. But what happens here is a little bit interesting related to suspense, because these posts, like the profile timeline, this renders first one time related to the initial render, which means that it throws a promise up to this suspense. And then it will, this one will resolve, which means that this one will kind of render again, and then it will throw another promise up to this suspense. So there are actually two promises operating there before the data is ready or the state is ready. And that means that when we actually get the state, we resolve two promises inside this suspense. And this is interesting because if we did the previous approach where we put the promise with the reading of the data, we could kind of like link the promise to reading a specific URL, for example. So we would kind of like have the same promise. But I guess, because what I'm thinking about here is like, does it matter how many promises we throw up to the suspense? And if we resolve like 5 promises synchronously, does React handle that? Does it actually resolve all the promises before it starts rendering again? I guess we could try to test that. Because this should render, let's see, let's try this just for fun. I didn't prepare this, but let's try it. Okay, so yeah, so now it rendered twice, which means, let's see, there it, oh, didn't it? Oh, sorry, we suspend here. Let's see, there we go. So it renders once, it renders twice. No, yeah, so you see, since we threw 2 promises up there, now it actually evaluated this twice, which is not actually a good thing. And I looked at the MobX implementation as well. And it would be the same there because it throws a promise every time it tries to evaluate this thing. But we really want to give it the same promise or not throw a new promise. I'm actually not sure. Maybe this is the case for, okay, I'm going way off here now. But let's take a look at the initial example as well. So this is the thing about React, is that it does a lot of unnecessary reconciliation, but it's there for consistency. Approach 3, here it is. I wonder if the same thing actually happens here. Let's see. So we have this thing. So let's see, console.log render, because this also kind of throws the same promise though, twice, but yeah, so you see here, it renders once and then only one time. So it seems that, for me, it seems that the suspense, it has like a map of the promises, or like a set, so that you can't have the same promise twice. So that means that we would basically need to optimize this code so that based on what you're trying to return here, we would need to create one promise. We would have to, yeah, evaluate to the same promise, which we can do with Overmind because we can actually track what you're trying to access inside this callback here, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, so I guess like with Redux, this wouldn't be as optimal because you're not able to link a promise to a specific state you're trying to look at. Yeah, this is interesting. So yeah, so this is not complete yet, but I hope it made some sense. And if I'm thinking about this the wrong way, please let me know. But yeah, I'll do another iteration on this and then we'll see where we are at. So thanks for following me. I hope it was in some way educational. It certainly has been for me. Understanding more about React, understanding more about suspense. Also, one thing I learned from this is that when you throw during the initial render, any state or references like useRef or whatever you've been using will not be there. So if you're trying to create a hook related to suspense, be aware of that. If that hook is producing some state and you expect that state to be there when the suspense is resolved, it won't be there. It will be like a brand new render. Okay, cool. Talk to you later. Bye bye.